Madison Washington was not an ordinary enslaved man. Born around 1815 in Virginia, he possessed qualities that would make him both a natural leader and a dangerous threat to the slave system: intelligence, charisma, and an unshakable belief in his own humanity. Unlike many enslaved people who had known no other life, Madison had tasted freedom and knew exactly what he was fighting for. In the late 1830s, Madison had accomplished what few enslaved people ever managed. He had successfully escaped to Canada via the Underground Railroad. For a brief, precious time, he lived as a free man in the Northern Territories, experiencing the dignity and autonomy that had been denied to him since birth. But freedom without his beloved wife was incomplete. Against all advice from abolitionists and fellow refugees, Madison made the dangerous decision to return to Virginia to rescue the woman he loved. The return journey proved catastrophic. Madison was captured, re-enslaved, and faced the brutal reality that his escape attempt had marked him as a particularly dangerous rebel in the eyes of his captors. The punishment for escaped slaves was severe, not just physical torture, but often immediate sale to the Deep South, where conditions were notoriously harsher and the possibility of escape virtually impossible. By November 1841, Madison found himself among 134 other enslaved people aboard the brig Creole, a domestic slave ship bound for the markets of New Orleans. The vessel was part of the vast internal slave trade that moved hundreds of thousands of enslaved people from the older slave states like Virginia to the expanding cotton plantations of the Deep South. For the human cargo aboard, this journey represented the final severing of family ties, cultural connections, and any remaining hope of reunion with loved ones. The conditions aboard the Creole were deliberately dehumanizing. Men, women, and children were chained together in the ship's hold, forced to endure overcrowding, inadequate food, poor sanitation, and the constant psychological torture of knowing they were being transported further from any possibility of freedom. The ship's crew, led by Captain Robert Enser, treated their human cargo as mere commodities, valuable only for their potential sale price in New Orleans. But among these 134 souls was a man who refused to accept his fate passively. Madison Washington began quietly assessing the situation, studying the crew's routines, noting the ship's vulnerabilities, and most importantly, identifying potential allies among his fellow captives. His experience of freedom had taught him something invaluable: that resistance was not just possible, but necessary. As the Creole sailed south through the coastal waters, Madison was planning something unprecedented. The genius of Madison Washington's plan lay not in its complexity, but in its careful simplicity and timing. As the Creole sailed down the Atlantic coast toward New Orleans, Madison used every moment to prepare for what would become one of the most successful slave revolts in American history. Working under the constant threat of discovery, Madison began building a network of trusted conspirators among the enslaved passengers. He had to be incredibly selective. One informant could doom the entire plan and result in savage punishment for all involved. Madison identified approximately 18 other enslaved men who possessed the courage and desperation necessary for such a dangerous undertaking. The challenge was enormous. The conspirators were chained, closely watched, and surrounded by an armed crew who were specifically trained to prevent exactly this type of uprising. Ship-based slave revolts were not unknown, and crews typically maintained strict security protocols. The enslaved people were kept below deck most of the time, brought up only in small groups for brief periods of exercise and air. Madison's leadership skills proved crucial during this planning phase. He had to maintain morale among men who knew they were likely sailing toward death or lifelong separation from their families. He helped them understand that their situation would only worsen once they reached New Orleans, where they would be sold to different masters and scattered across the vast plantations of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. The plan Madison developed was audacious in its scope. Rather than simply attempting to overpower the crew and escape, which would likely result in their eventual recapture and execution, Madison envisioned taking complete control of the ship and sailing it to freedom. His time in Canada had taught him about British colonial territories in the Caribbean where slavery had been abolished, particularly the Bahamas, which were relatively close to their current position. On the evening of November 6, 1841, as the Creole sailed to the waters off the Virginia coast, Madison gave his fellow conspirators their final instructions. They would wait until the next morning when some of the enslaved passengers were brought on deck for their daily exercise period. This would be their only opportunity to act while having access to both the upper deck and some freedom of movement. Madison understood that violence would likely be necessary, but he was strategic about its application. The primary targets would be the slave traders aboard the ship, particularly John R. Howell, who was known for his exceptional cruelty. The ship's regular crew members might be spared if they cooperated with the takeover. November 7, 1841, dawned clear and calm off the coast of Virginia. But by sunset, the Creole would be forever changed, and Madison Washington would have secured his place in history as one of America's most successful slave rebels. The revolt began around 9 p.m. when a group of enslaved men were brought on deck for their evening exercise period. Madison Washington and his conspirators had spent the day in tense anticipation, knowing that this moment would determine whether they achieved freedom or faced certain death. The signal came when Madison gave a predetermined word. Suddenly, 19 enslaved men moved with coordinated precision that shocked the crew with its organization and determination. They had managed to break free from some of their restraints and immediately began overpowering the sailors on deck. The crew of the Creole was caught completely off guard by the sophistication and coordination of the uprising. This was not a spontaneous outburst of desperation, but carefully planned military operation led by a man who understood strategy and leadership. Madison Washington directed his men with the skill of a natural general, ensuring that key positions on the ship were secured simultaneously. The first and most important target was John R. Howell, the slave trader whose reputation for cruelty had made him particularly hated among the enslaved passengers. Howell attempted to resist the rebels, drawing weapons and trying to rally the crew to suppress the uprising. In the violent struggle that followed, Howell was killed, not in cold blood, but in the fierce combat that erupted as he tried to maintain control over people fighting for their freedom. Captain Robert Enser and several crew members were wounded in the fighting, but Madison Washington demonstrated remarkable strategic restraint. Rather than allowing the violence to escalate into a massacre, he quickly moved to secure the ship and establish control. His goal was liberation, not revenge, and he understood that excessive bloodshed would only complicate their path to freedom. With the ship under rebel control, Madison faced his next crucial decision: where to sail for sanctuary. He knew that returning to any American port would mean immediate recapture and execution for all involved. His experience in Canada had taught him about British colonial policies regarding slavery, and he made the strategic decision to sail toward Nassau in Bahamas, where British law had abolished slavery. The transformation aboard the Creole was immediate and profound. The enslaved passengers who had been chained in the hold were brought up on deck and told they were now free. Madison Washington had not only liberated himself, but had become the liberator of 134 other souls. The ship that had been carrying them toward deeper bondage was now sailing toward freedom. However, the rebels faced significant challenges. Few of them had any experience with navigation or sailing, and they were traveling through waters where American naval vessels might intercept them at any moment. Madison had to maintain discipline and hope among people who had lived their entire lives without agency, while simultaneously learning to command a ship and evade potential pursuit. The Creole arrived in Nassau Harbor on November 9, 1841, creating an immediate international crisis that would test the principles of both British abolition and American slavery. The sight of a former slave ship, now commanded by formerly enslaved people, sent shockwaves to the colonial administration and American diplomatic circles. William Cockburn, the British colonial governor of the Bahamas, found himself at the center of a diplomatic storm. The American consul, John F. Bacon, immediately demanded the return of what he termed stolen American property, both the ship and the 134 formerly enslaved people aboard. Bacon argued that the Creole was an American vessel engaged in legal commerce under U.S. law, and that the rebels were pirates and murderers who should be extradited to face American justice. But British law presented a fundamental contradiction to these demands. Under the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, any enslaved person who set foot on British soil automatically became free. The Bahamas had been a haven for freedom seekers for nearly a decade, and the colonial government had established clear precedents for protecting former slaves who reached British territory. Madison Washington emerged as the primary spokesman for the rebels, demonstrating diplomatic skills that matched his military leadership. Speaking with intelligence and dignity before British officials, he articulated their case with precision. They were not pirates or criminals, but people fighting for the fundamental human right to freedom. He explained that they had killed John Howell not in cold blood, but in legitimate self-defense during their fight for liberation. The British public and press rallied to support the Creole rebels. Abolitionist newspapers in London and Nassau praised Madison Washington as a hero and freedom fighter. The case became a symbol of the moral superiority of British abolition over American slavery, and public pressure mounted on colonial authorities to grant the rebels their freedom. However, the situation remained diplomatically delicate. The British government was attempting to maintain peaceful relations with the United States, and completely ignoring American demands could escalate into a serious international incident. Colonial authorities initially agreed to detain the 5 rebels most directly involved in the fighting, including Madison Washington, while releasing the other 129 passengers as free people. The detention was brief and largely symbolic. Within weeks, even Madison Washington and his 4 companions were released, as British officials determined that their actions constituted legitimate resistance to unlawful bondage rather than criminal piracy. The decision sent a clear message. Britain would not cooperate in returning people to slavery, regardless of American diplomatic pressure. The ultimate success of the Creole Revolt marked a turning point not just for Madison Washington and his fellow rebels, but for the entire international debate over slavery and human rights. By early 1842, all 134 formerly enslaved passengers had gained their freedom under British protection, representing the largest single liberation of enslaved Americans through direct action. Madison Washington himself largely vanished from historical records after achieving his freedom, which was perhaps the greatest testament to his success. Unlike other prominent figures in the resistance to slavery, Madison had no interest in becoming a public symbol or celebrity. His goal had always been simple: to live as a free man with his wife. Some accounts suggest he remained in the Bahamas, while others indicate he may have eventually reunited with his wife, possibly in Canada or another British territory where they could live safely together. The diplomatic repercussions of the Creole case extended far beyond the Caribbean. In Washington, D.C., Southern politicians raged about the British refusal to return stolen property and demanded military action to protect American commercial interests. They argued that Britain's actions encouraged slave rebellions and undermined the constitutional protections for slavery guaranteed by American law. Northern abolitionists, meanwhile, celebrated the Creole Revolt as proof that enslaved people were not content with their bondage and would fight courageously for freedom when given the opportunity. Frederick Douglass, himself an escaped slave, praised Madison Washington as a true American hero who had struck a blow for liberty that rivaled the actions of the Founding Fathers. The case became part of broader diplomatic negotiations between Britain and the United States, ultimately influencing the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. While the treaty resolved various boundary disputes and trade issues, it notably failed to establish clear protocols for handling future cases like the Creole, leaving the fundamental questions about slavery and international law unresolved. Perhaps most significantly, the Creole Revolt demonstrated that enslaved people were not passive victims waiting for outside rescue, but active agents capable of organizing sophisticated resistance movements. Madison Washington's leadership proved that enslaved people possess the intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking necessary to win their own freedom through direct action. The success of the revolt also highlighted the international dimensions of American slavery. The existence of British territories where slavery was illegal provided a crucial sanctuary that made such liberation possible. This international aspect would continue to influence American slavery debates, particularly regarding the expansion of slavery into new territories and the enforcement of fugitive slave laws. The Creole case inspired other resistance efforts and became part of the growing body of evidence that slavery was not a stable, permanent institution, but a system under constant pressure from both internal resistance and international opposition. The image of Madison Washington commanding a ship full of liberated people sailing toward freedom became a powerful symbol of Black agency and resistance. Madison Washington's achievement was remarkable not just for its immediate success, but for what it represented about human dignity and the universal desire for freedom. He had transformed a ship of bondage into a vessel of liberation, turning what was meant to be a journey deeper into slavery into a voyage toward freedom for 134 people. The story of Madison Washington and the Creole Revolt reminds us that the end of American slavery was not achieved solely through political processes or military campaigns, but also through the courageous actions of enslaved people who refused to accept their bondage passively. Madison Washington stands as a testament to the power of strategic thinking, courageous leadership, and the unbreakable human desire for freedom. His successful revolt remains one of the most remarkable liberation stories in American history, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit could triumph over oppression.